Okay, so welcome guys to the next video. Right now we're going to discuss let and const in depth. I know that we have been using them throughout the helpers videos, but I never really took time to create a video solely on them, so now I'm going to do exactly that. So let's get started. First, let's revisit how we used to use the var keyword and how it behaves. So let's start with some simple example. Let's simply declare a var variable. Let's call it title, and let's put in the title of this video, which should be let and const lesson, for example. Okay, and now let's simply log it out like this. Okay, so nothing too complex nor interesting. Again, I'm going to be using nodes, but as I've said like numerous times already, feel free to use anything that you want for these videos. The focus really isn't on nodes, so you can use either like the dev tools inside of your favorite browser, or you can use sites like JSBean and Playcode, and there are like a number of those sites out there. So I'm going to type node and then the file name, and we see this text. Okay, so if you think about it, you pretty much use the var keyword to declare a variable that will belong to the current function scope or to the global scope if at the top level outside of any function. So what that means is right now we have declared this title variable in the global scope. It isn't part of any function. But of course we can create some function. Let's create one. Let's call the function greet, and let's move this title variable inside, and then let's print it inside of there. And now let's simply call the greet function like this. And we see the exact same thing. What is also interesting about the var keywords, and in fact the way JavaScript works, is if we have this variable declared outside of this function like this, and we try to run it again, let's see what will happen, and it will work again, because like this inner scope has access to all the variables declared inside of this function scope, as well as any variable declared in the global scope. So if I declare here another variable, let's call it file name. I'm running out of ideas, so bear with me. Like this, okay? And now I try to console log both the file name and the title. We should see both of them, okay? But if I try to console log both of them outside of this function like this, and let me comment out this so we don't get confused on what's currently running. So if you think about it, we're now trying to access a file name variable which is local to this function scope over here, and the title variable which is in the global scope. So what should happen is that we should have access to a title because that's in the global scope, but not the file name because it's in the function scope. So let's see what happens, and we get a reference error that file name is not defined because this line over here doesn't have access to any function scope, so it basically can't see this variable at all. Now what's also interesting about how JavaScript functions is a thing called hoisting. So if let's say that we had this variable file name, okay, first let me actually delete this, and let's say I move this variable declaration and initialization up above. So now if you think about it, this console log is trying to access a local variable called file name that hasn't been yet defined at this line 5th over here, because it is defined like on the next line. But if we take a look at what happens now, we see that it's undefined. And why is that? Well, what happens is when the JavaScript goes through this code, it first makes one pass through our code and notices that we have a var file name declaration on the line 6. So it then basically pulls this part over here above this, like on the top level of this function scope, like here. It brings the var file name, this piece of code, over here. And then when we try to access the file name, well, the JavaScript is aware that there is a file name variable, but right now this piece over here doesn't contain the value code worker, and any variable which doesn't contain any value is undefined by default. To prove you that, let me simply make a small example over here. Let's say var name, and let's simply try to console.log the name. We should see undefined again. As you can see, we see undefined. So that's called hoisting. But what you can do, for example, is you can say we know that it will be hoisted up above, so we are free to like type file name equals code worker. Previously you might look at this and be like, sure, but the variable hasn't even been declared yet, but as I told you, it actually is due to that hoisting. So the code will pretty much be like this in the JavaScript engine eyes. So if I bring it like this and I try to run this once again, we should see code worker appearing. Okay, that hoisting effect can also take place outside of any function. So let's make a similar thing over here. Let's say that that we want to console.log a title that is declared below this line, and let's say that we remove this piece of text over here, and we say title equals that piece of text, but I want to get rid of this title. Okay, now if I try to run this again, you'll see that it works. Now what will happen if I comment out this piece over here? We see a text, because JavaScript, when it's not running in the strict mode, actually figures out that this title variable doesn't yet exist, so it actually creates it for you. So you can almost think of this example as this one. This part over here is what JavaScript does for you in the background. However, let's say that we are using strict mode, and let's run it once again. And now we see reference error. The title is not defined because this strict mode prevented JavaScript to actually create this title variable and create it to be of a global scope. And if I delete this comment over here and try to run this once again, you see that it works. So this is just some like small details of how var keyword in JavaScript works and how that hoisting affects that. Now let's switch to the let keyword and let me show you the differences. So for starters, let me declare the same thing, like the same idea, just using the let instead of var. So I'm going to type let and const lesson like this, and first of all let's log it out, so this will work like it used to. Okay, we see everything that we expected to see. Okay, so now let's get back to this function example and see what's changed. So let's create a function called greet. Okay, and now let's move this variable declaration inside of this function, and let's also move this console.log inside of this function, and now let's simply call the greet function, and we see the same thing. Okay, now let me move this piece below the console.log and check what happens now. Now as you can see, this doesn't work anymore. The let keyword prevents title variable from being hoisted, which is super awesome in my opinion, because that hoisting can actually do you more harm than good in my opinion. You should always first declare your variables and then use them afterwards. So as you can see, this is like one of the big changes of the let, because if you remember, if I just switch to var and try this example again, it will work. It will print undefined, but you already learned why is that. And using let, we get a reference error. It's like one of the big changes. Okay, that's one big change. Now let me show you another big change, and it has to do with something called block scoping. So the block scoping is any piece of code that you have between two curly braces. So for example, you can think of let's say if statements. Everything between these two curly braces is so-called block scope. You also have like for loops, while loops, anything of that nature. And now let's see how var and let behaves differently in those block scopes. So let's create one silly example. Let's say if 5 equals to 5, okay, and now let's create a var variable over here. Let's call it again title, why not, but actually let me call it name, it's a bit easier. Let me put in Stefan in there. And now let's try to access the console with console.log that variable. So what are we doing now is we have declared a variable inside of this block scope, and now we are trying to access it outside of that block scope on the global scope. And this will work, which if you're coming from some other programming language like Java or C# or C++, if I'm not mistaken, this wouldn't behave this way. What would happen is you would get an error that the name variable doesn't exist at this line over here, because this variable over here isn't accessible outside. But if I change this var keyword to let and try to do the exact same thing, now we get that error that I mentioned. Now it says that the name is not defined. So why is it? Well, the let keyword actually makes variables to be block scoped, which is something that you weren't really able to do before the ES6, but luckily now that's the case. So now whenever you declare a variable with like let keyword, you know that it will be accessible only throughout that block scope where it is actually defined. That's like the major thing behind the let keyword, and that's the reason why it's so useful. It's much harder to mess up your code, especially when you have like a long file, let's say, and you try to change something and in fact you are able to, but you were not supposed to do that. Now it will simply complain and no harm will be done to your software. Now that's pretty much it about the let keyword. Like the bottom line is that you should be using it whenever you can. I know that I'm not sure like today like how many browsers support like what part of ES6, but they're like closing in pretty quickly, so I'm sure that you can use let like pretty much everywhere. If you have any problems with that, you can always use transpilers or like polyfills to enable you to write the code in the ES6 fashion, and then that code will be converted to ES5 behind the scenes, so any older browser can still run your code. Now let's move to the const, the topic of const keyword. Well, first of all, as you can probably imagine, const keyword represents pretty much the constant. So if you were to use var, and let's say you want to declare like a pi constant, like 3.14. First of all, like the rule of thumb is that whenever you declare a constant values, you should name them like with uppercase, like this. And now we can of course console.log pi. Okay, sure thing. We remove this. But one like negative part surrounding the var keyword, and like the other negative is what you've just seen, is that you can simply go here and totally change the variable and it will still work. Using let, similar thing will happen. Okay, and that's where the const comes in. So if I declare this pi with a const keyword and I try to modify its value later on, you'll see that we'll in fact get an error, that type error, assignment to a constant variable, which is pretty awesome because it doesn't allow you to change your constant values. But there is one thing that you need to be aware of. Whenever you assign object to a constant keyword, you can still change it, and that's because objects are of a reference type. Now, just one fun fact, if you're not aware, in JavaScript, arrays are actually of a type object, objects are of a type object, and even functions are of a type object. So when I say object, I in fact mean arrays and objects in this scenario over here. So if I make some new example here, let's say that we have like const games and we have an array of games, and let's put some games in there. Let's put GTA 5, let's put CSGO, and let's put EVE Online, like this. And now let us simply const.log those games to our terminal over here, and everything is fine. But what will happen if I now come here and do the games.push, basically modify this array, and let's say that we want to add a new game to this list, and that game is League of Legends. Now what do you think will happen? Like, there are a couple of scenarios. First, it can work, so we will see like all the 4 games inside of array. And secondly, it can fail and we can get an error, similarly to the one we got previously when it said assignment to a constant variable. So if I run this code over here, we're going to see that this actually works. And in case you're surprised, it's because, like I said, objects are of a reference type. So what happens in the background is you are actually assigning to this games variable not this array in particular, but instead a pointer to where this array is located in your memory. And when you think about it, when you use games.push, you aren't really changing that pointer. That pointer still points to that particular location in memory. But what you're actually doing is you're modifying that location by putting in a new value in there. So I have prepared some slides for this, so hopefully that will make it a bit more clearer. Okay, so as I was saying, let's pretend that this is your memory and you have like a bunch of different things inside of here, but among those things you have this array that you just created. Now whenever you assign that array to some variable, you're actually assigning a pointer to that location in memory. So you can think about that like this. Every slot, let's call it like this, every slot in this memory has a unique memory address that points to that location. When you go const games equals array, what you're doing in the background is basically assigning this address value of that memory slot to this games variable over here. And then when we added a new game to this array, we didn't really change this address at all. In fact, what we have done is we went to that address and simply modified some content in there. But if you think about it, this const games variable still holds this same pointer over there. That's the reason why you don't get an error, and that's the reason why, if you're unaware of this, you might be wondering like, how can you, like, why am I able to edit a constant variable? Okay, so hopefully that cleared some things for you, but now I'm going to show you something else to further confuse you. Kidding. But let's think about different scenario. Let's think about something else. Let's say that I do this, const games equals this, and then I come here on the next line and write games equals, you know what, I'm going to create a new array this time, and let's put cats and dogs in there. Okay, and now what do you think will happen? Well, make your guess. Okay, I'm going to run it, and this time we get the same error that we got when we tried to reassign a pi value. So what happens now is this time we aren't really modifying this end location, so to speak, but we're actually modifying the games variable by providing a new pointer that this time points to this array, not this one that we had previously. Okay, so jumping into these slides might make this more clearer. So what we have now done is we had made previously this slot over here in our memory with this memory address, but now when we went and wrote const games equal, but okay, forgot about the const, we just reassigned the games variable to this new array. What actually happened is that there were some empty space in our memory, and in that space we occupied it with our new array of cats and dogs, and because that's a new memory location, we have got a new memory address. Now we need to tell the games that pointer so it can hold a reference to it, and this time, as you can see, we broke this old address with this new one, and that's the reason why we get error this time. I just want to show you one more example using objects this time, and the same thing will happen. I just want you to see this. So let's say that we have const game this time, and let's describe one of these games. I'm going to create a new object for it, and let's say title, let's say GTA 5, release date, release year, I have no idea honestly, I'm going to put 2008, and let's say what can I say, something else about it, let's say price, and let's say it costs like $50. And now of course I can console.log this game, and we see what we expected to see. But now what if we come here and we write a game, and using the dot notation we access a price property, and we want to reassign that value to be like $100. What do you think will happen? Well, if you carefully listened to the previous example, I'm sure that you can assume that everything will be fine, because like in the previous example, we aren't really modifying the pointer to this space in memory, but in fact we are going there and simply changing what's inside of that memory slot. So this of course works. Of course, if you were to come here and assign a totally new object, every time you create a new object, a new space in memory gets filled with that object, and every space in memory has its memory address. So by doing this, we are now trying to basically change the pointer that is contained inside of this game variable over here. So if I now try to replace a game with some other game, I'm not sure what was on the list, let's say EVE Online, let's say 2000, let's say 15, and try to run this, we will get an error, because like previously we're now modifying the pointer, not just the value that is contained in there. So hopefully this wasn't too confusing. If it was confusing to you, I suggest that you do some of these examples on your own, or maybe watch some parts of this video again if you want to. The main thing that you should take away from this video is that you really shouldn't use var unless you have to in this day and age. You should pretty much use let and const for every JavaScript variable declaration that you do. and that you can use const when you need some constant value, or when you want to prevent yourself in the future from accidentally modifying that value. You can use let. Otherwise, you remember that let is only accessible in the block scope that it is contained within, and it is not hoisted, which is super awesome if you ask me. And that's about it. So I'll see you in the next video. I hope you like this one, and bye until then.